Hi, my name is Jenna Myers, and today I'm going to be talking about the gastric phase regulation of the digestive system. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to find my presentation. Um, again, I chose the regulation of the gastric phase in digestion. Actually, before we start talking about the actual gastric phase, we're going to briefly chat about the phase prior, which is called the cephalic phase. And this is triggered by the long vagal reflex before food actually enters the stomach. And this can be triggered by smell, sight, thoughts of food even, and then eventually by the actual presence of food in the mouth, which after it's swallowed will enter the stomach. And then that is the beginning of the gastric phase when food is actually in the stomach. And this causes stimuli in the lumen that initiate short reflexes that involuntarily control this entire gastric phase. So the two are kind of integrated. So I needed to discuss that a little bit before we jump into my bulk of the presentation. And on the right here is just kind of like an intro. I think you'll see this image on the right again of the lumen, where a lot of these things are secreted and a lot of these important cells are located that we'll be talking about throughout the presentation. So just kind of a brief introduction to that. The book lays out kind of three general functions of the stomach, and so that's kind of how I laid out my presentation. I thought it is an easy way to flow through kind of the different steps of digestion and just regulation in general of the whole gastric phase. So this is just kind of a brief overview, so I won't spend too much time on this slide. So first function is obviously storage. I think that's kind of intuitive to most of us that the stomach stores food. And it does this through receptive relaxation. So when food actually enters the stomach, it distends or expands to hold the food and the amount of food that's coming in. And this is a neurally mediated reflex, like we discussed earlier, a short reflex in the gastric phase versus the long vagal reflexes in the cephalic phase. The upper stomach is the actual part of the stomach that stores the food, so the proximal stomach stores the food. The distal stomach that actually does the digestion, which is not, it's intuitive now in hindsight, but I thought that was interesting when I was doing research for this presentation. That's something I didn't know before. So the actual digestion is, when food is mechanically and chemically kind of mixed together into this substance called chyme, which is like a soupy mixture that's eventually transferred into the small intestine. So chyme is made up of, the partially digested food, all the secretions, acid secretions, histamine, all that stuff that we'll talk about later, and then enzymes. So it's a combination of all those three things. And in the digestion phase, we're really going to focus on secretions, and I'm not going to go too much into this right now, but we'll talk about main four types of secretion that go on during digestion and what all these secretions do. And then thirdly, the defense of the gastric phase, which consists of mucus bicarbonate barrier. That's actually a layer, like a physical layer, protecting the walls of the stomach from, its own acidic digestive environment. And if any foreign substances or bacteria get into the stomach, this is how it protects itself. So we're going to move on to storage. So storage, I just kind of wrote a little blurb about it there. We kind of already know, like I already discussed, we kind of already understand that the stomach holds food. And the proximal half actually holds the food until digestion, and this is allowed by receptive relaxation, which is the kind of distension, of the stomach. And the distal half actually does the digestion, which occurs in peristaltic waves, which are involuntary movements that create kind of wave-like contractions to move food along its path and digest it further. We talked about the food plus the acid and secretions and the digestive enzymes that make up the soupy mixture called chyme that is then moved on to the small intestine. So this is kind of the bulk of my presentation, is the secretions, gastric secretions. Up there I have protect and digest, because it's not only secreting substances that help digest food, but it's also secreting substances that protect the stomach in that defense function that I talked about earlier. And so on this slide, we're just going to talk about secretions, but the next slide I want to talk about the barrier, but just know that secretions include both digestive substances and substances to protect the stomach. So jumping right in, first thing I'm going to talk about is gastrin secretion, which is secreted by G cells into the blood, and this promotes the release of gastric acid or stomach acid that breaks down food. And then these are mediated by neural reflexes as well, like we've been discussing thus far. And you can see that in the table over here. So G cells stimulate secretion of gastric, that stimulates the gastric acid to secrete. And it also talks about stimulus for release, so acetylcholine, peptides, amino acid will also stimulate the secretion of this gastric acid, so that's good to know as well. As far as the actual secretion of the acid, it is secreted by parietal cells in the lumen, and the amount of acid secreted in the stomach is actually 1 to 3 liters per day, so it's a substantial amount. This secretion activates pepsin, which digests proteins. Yep, there we go. And just a few little other things about this, about the acid. It can kill the bacteria due to its very acidic pH, and other ingested microorganisms as well. And this acid actually inactivates salivary amylase, which stops the digestion of carbohydrates in the mouth. And it says parietal cell pathway right here. So it kind of talks about the cellular level of the pathway for acid secretion, which is important, very important in the digestion of food. So I'm just going to go over that briefly. So hydrogen ions from water inside the parietal cell are actually pumped into the stomach lumen by hydrogen potassium ATPase that exchange for potassium that's entering the cell. And then chloride actually follows a concentration gradient created by the hydrogen ions. So the net result is the secretion of HCl by the cell, or hydrochloric acid, gastric acid right here. And a little fun fact, they talk about PPIs, or proton pump inhibitors, that block the activity of the hydrogen potassium ATPase. So when the acid is secreted into the lumen, bicarbonate from water is absorbed into the blood from CO2 and OH groups, and this buffer makes blood leaving the stomach more alkaline, and this is done by proton pump inhibitors. So the next thing we're going to talk about is enzyme secretion. So the stomach produces 2 enzymes, pepsin and gastric lipase, and the pepsin is important in the digestion of proteins, and is secreted as inactive pepsinogen by chief cells in the gastric glands. And then the acid stimulates pepsinogen release through short reflexes mediated in the enteric nervous system. That was difficult for me to say. Gastric lipase is co-secreted with pepsin, so they're secreted together. And then the gastric lipase breaks down triglycerides. So just remember, pepsin breaks down proteins, and gastric lipase breaks down triglycerides. And I'm not sure if that's in this. Oh yeah, it is. Here we go. Pepsin, proteins, gastric lipase, digests fats. And then it's also stimulated by acetylcholine and acid secretion. Last thing, oh yeah, we already talked about this, mediated by short reflexes in the enteric nervous system, or ENS. Paracrine secretions are include histamine, intrinsic factor, and somatostatin. So I'm going to go through those one by one. So histamine is a signal secreted by enterochromaffin-like cells, or ECL cells. This is in response to gastrin or acetylcholine stimulation, and this diffuses to target parietal cells to stimulate acid secretion by combining H2 receptors on parietal cells. And little fun fact, so H2 receptor antagonists like ranitidine or over-the-counter Zantac block this histamine and treat hypersecretion if that's an issue for patients. So moving on to intrinsic factor, this is a protein secreted by the same cells that secrete acid. And these intrinsic factors complex with B12 in the lumen of the stomach, and this is needed for B12 absorption. So it's pretty specific, but good to know that intrinsic factor is important in the absorption of vitamin B12. And then somatostatin actually inhibits pepsinogen secretion. So somatostatin is secreted by D cells in the stomach, and this secretion of the somatostatin is the primary negative feedback signal for gastric phase secretions. So once this kind of stops the release of further enzymes, so it kind of stops the gastric or the digestion phase. So the chyme is ready to be moved into the small intestine where absorption can take place. So busy slide, but I think this little table here is really helpful in remembering all these things and studying them. So the defense is the last thing we're going to talk about. This protects the stomach walls from indigestion and from its own acidic environment, and also from microorganisms and bacteria that get into the stomach. So mucus cells are on the laminal surface and the neck of the gastric glands, and these glands secrete this mucus bicarbonate layer, and obviously you can see from the image that the bicarbonate layer lies underneath the mucus layer. So the mucus layer is the physical barrier between the gastric environment and the bicarbonate layer down there. Yep, that's about what I just discussed. So looking at the bicarbonate layer, it's a neutralizing barrier. It's a buffer barrier that protects the wall from the very acidic environment. As you can see over here, the pH of gastric juice is 2, while at the cell surface, it's about 7. Moving on, beneath the mucus layer, pH of 7. And it's made up of CO2 and OH groups from water. So the mucus bicarbonate barrier can actually fail, which causes peptic ulcers when acid and pepsin destroy the mucosal layer and create holes here in the stomach. Ulcers also can be created by acid reflux, H. pylori, which is inflammation of the gastric mucosa, and it's not on here, but also by excess NSAID use or nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drug use, which is like ibuprofen or Advil, things like that can also create ulcers, which are very uncomfortable and can sometimes require medical attention. So to sum up, we can go back. This is a not very orthodox way of doing this, but I just want to go back to this slide here. So to sum up, just remember the 3 general functions of the stomach: storage, digestion, and defense, and what goes on in each of these functions or steps in the gastric phase of digestion. And it's kind of a good way to, remember what goes on and to separate the information. So storage, digestion, defense, and then after the stomach has digested in the gastric phase, then it moves on to the intestinal phase of digestion. Thank you.